Hello and welcome to Friday Cafe After Hours. I'm Judy Carson. I'm with the Connecticut State Department of Education. I'm joined by my colleague and co-host Betsy Laborious from CREC. And tonight is the second in a series of 3 sessions focused on reimagining full, equal, and equitable school-family partnerships. And we're talking about a make or break tool for effective partnerships, and that's two-way conversations. We're thrilled that Joelle Murchison is with us tonight. She'll be guiding our conversation and sharing a number of tips and tools. A number of people are new to Friday Cafe, so let me tell you just a bit about it. Friday Cafe is Connecticut's network for family engagement, now in our 7th year, and we have 3 main goals. One is to build connections between people who work in family engagement and anyone who's interested in what we call the intersection between families and schools. Another goal is to expand our thinking and spark new ideas that help shift us from low-impact practice to high-impact practice. And the third goal is to develop an identity for this work and help schools and communities understand that engaging families in education is critical to student success. Along with our 3 goals, we have a number of values, and these have come from our community. From people like you that have been part of Friday Cafe. And as a group, we are welcoming and strengths-based. This is jointly owned, and we have equal voices. And Betsy and I and others are the conveners. We have an advisory group, but we really take our lead from our advisory group and from you as participants. Friday Cafe is also an engine of generosity, and it's restorative for people to do this work. We know this is hard work and it can be isolating. And so Friday Cafe is that place we come to get our batteries recharged. So speaking of jointly owned, we had a number of members of this community who talked to us about offering an opportunity for people who can't be with us on Friday mornings. That's when we usually hold our Friday Cafe sessions. And so we created these after hours events for people like parents and teachers who had a hard time joining us during the day. Our next session is going to be November 19th, and you don't want to miss that. We're going to be talking about linking family engagement to student learning. And our first session, if you missed that last month, on culture and inclusion, trust and respect, that is recorded, and that's on the Friday Cafe website. We're grounding these conversations in Connecticut's definition for family engagement. This was developed with lots of families and professionals in Connecticut, and it speaks to full, equal, and equitable partnerships. And we talk about those partnerships among families, educators, community members, first through college and career. And I have to tell you, as the parent of a 21-year-old, I don't think we're ever done. So those partnerships might even have to go a lot further than that. With our definition, we also have 7 guiding principles. You'll recognize that our sessions are paralleling these guiding principles: trust and respect, two-way conversations, linking to learning. Our other principles about culturally responsive practice and recognizing parents as leaders are woven throughout each of these sessions. If you'd like to know more about Connecticut's definition, guiding principles, and family engagement framework, you can find that on the State Department of Education website, and you can see a range of examples of high impact practice in family engagement. I definitely recommend taking a look at that. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our facilitator for this evening, Joelle Murchison. She is the executive director of Exec Mommy Group, and she is a business leader, a community leader, an educator, and a sought after facilitator. And we're thrilled that she has become a Friday Cafe partner. So Joelle, take it away.
Thank you so much, Judy. I really appreciate and value this partnership. Also, as a parent, it is critically important to me that we develop ways to enhance the relationships between school and community. So I'm really pleased to be a part of this effort. So some of you hopefully were with us last time, where we spent the session talking about respect and trust as cornerstones of family and school engagement. And at the time, I shared some guidelines with us to frame our time together, which I am sharing again on the screen. I'm not going to read them all because I think it's really important that you take the opportunity to read them for yourself. But I will highlight just a couple as we think about our opportunities to engage in dialogue with one another tonight, of which you will have. I'm going to share some content with you similarly to last time. But this week, or this month, I should say, we really are emphasizing an opportunity for you to engage in dialogue in small groups. You'll have the opportunity to participate in a scenario that will help you to build and develop the tools that will help you to develop successful two-way conversations. So as you probably can imagine, many of these guidelines not only are critical for our time together tonight, but they are absolutely critical in engaging spaces for two-way conversation. Respect, certainly, listening to seek understanding, being open to discomfort. Sometimes we are hearing things in our conversations that maybe make us a little uncomfortable. But as we know, the discomfort allows us to grow. One mic, meaning one person speaking at a time, which is also a part of respect. Using I statements. We all come from various different backgrounds and perspectives, and no one's opinion or perspective or experience is not important. As a result, we want to make sure that when you speak to your experiences, you own them and you talk to things in the context of, I think, I've experienced, what I've learned, as opposed to generalizing for the experiences of all of those who might be within your school community, your family, etc. So hopefully all of you, I cannot see all of you on the screen at this time, but hopefully you all have read through these guidelines and you believe that you too can agree to these guidelines as we move through tonight's program. If that is the case, please feel free to shake your head yes, give me a thumbs up, either on screen or using the reactions button in Zoom, and we will go forward. All right, sounds good. So the questions for today's discussion, just some things that will set the tone for what we plan to talk about. What are difficult conversations? So in the context of two-way conversations, most instances, the ones that we avoid are the difficult ones. And what are they? Why are they difficult? How can we navigate them? What are the costs if we don't navigate them? What are the benefits if we do? And then what's next? So that is what we are essentially covering in the context of this conversation. So I just want you to take a moment to think about, for you, what prevents you from engaging in difficult conversations? If you feel so inclined, I would love for you to type into the chat and let us know, what are the things that prevent you from engaging in difficult conversations? Or if you're interested, you can unmute and share with us. So what are some of the things that prevent you from engaging in difficult conversations? Absolutely. We don't want to offend anyone, right? We're afraid the situation could get worse. Absolutely. Those unintended consequences, or perhaps that ignorance would be revealed. Not sure how my comments will be taken. Absolutely. Fear of hurting feelings. Absolutely. All of those things. Being misunderstood. Yes. All of those things prevent us from engaging in those conversations. And all of us can say, because I certainly can agree, just because I'm the facilitator does not mean that I'm perfect at it either. I can think about some conversations that I should be having that I've just kind of avoided. And some of it is because of all the reasons that have been shared. So I want to share with you a video that I think is a really neat way of demonstrating the opportunity that we have as we begin to lean in to difficult conversations. This is a professor of economics from a university, but I love the way he talks about it. So I'm going to pray that this works in here. If not, I will flip out and flip to the internet to play it. So here we go.
It is precisely at those times that communication is most vital to achieve your goals, that conversations break down most dramatically. That's why difficult conversations are scary. The stakes are high. There's a high cost to fail. And yet, that's when failure is most likely. bad conversation?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Are you afraid you might have a bad conversation tomorrow or this week? Okay. We all have bad conversations, and we're all worried that these bad conversations will continue. So if we can step confidently into these conversations, knowing that we can manage the process, then a whole new world opens up. If I push and I say, you're wrong, what do you want to do?
You're wrong.
And what do you think I want to do?
Push back.
Exactly. You're wrong.
No, you're wrong.
Okay. So now we escalate. Everyone's spending a lot of energy, and where are we going?
Nowhere.
Nowhere.
We're pushing with our hands, and we're pushing with our words. And each one of us trying to push the other person out by saying, I am right, and you're wrong. And if you follow the rule, when someone pushes, push back, you're always going to end up stuck. But we need to change this. But now when you push, I'm not going to push back. And when you say you're wrong, I'm going to yield and say, well, show me, what do you see that I don't? You know, I'm from Argentina. So what does this look like?
Tango.
I'm going to turn this into a dance. I mean, she thinks she's right. And she's seeing something I don't because I think I'm right. So the first step in this conversation is for me to look genuinely and say, oh, that's what you're seeing. I couldn't see it because it was behind me. Now she's going to give me permission to say, can I show you what I see that you haven't seen before? So let me show you. And here, now I'm going to turn a little more. You see, this was behind you and you couldn't see it. You want three things out of a conversation. You want to feel good about yourself. You want to relate to the other person positively. And you want to achieve your goals. Get something done, solve a problem. We're going to call.
All right. I love that video because it really demonstrates very clearly to us the opportunity that we have when it comes to two-way conversations. Most of us, just like the initial demonstration, will push until we get our way. Now, certainly as we think about the external environment around us, that polarization is very clearly demonstrated. So it's very hard to recalibrate so that in the conversations that we have within our personal lives or our work lives are much more in line with the notion of turning to see, in fact, what the other person's perspective is. Now, most of us may not be dancers. I don't encourage you to try to do the tango, but I do encourage you to think about what it would mean in your mind if you were to simply turn to see what the other person can see. It would change your perspective. There are two types, essentially, of difficult conversations. One, the planned conversation. The things that you've scheduled, you know they're going to happen. There's likely a subject matter that has been decided upon, and the circumstances have already been arranged. You've scheduled the date on the calendar, the Zoom link has been provided, and you know what the topic is. The second type of conversation that can be a difficult conversation are the unplanned conversations. Those happen on the spur of the moment. Many times they are fueled by emotion. Something has triggered that conversation, or at least the need for it to take place right away. Now, when we think about the notion of cross-cultural communication, and we talked a lot last week about the ways that different cultural norms embrace trust or respect. So when we think about different factors that can impact those difficult conversations, whether planned or unplanned, there are a number of different things that come into play. And in most of our school communities, whether we're talking about race or gender or sexual orientation, disability, geography, leadership role or position, authority, all of those things are different dimensions of diversity. And in effect, they are individuals who are interacting across a variety of different cultures, across different dimensions. We have different expectations and we have different assumptions. And so some of the things that step out and stand out as factors that affect our ability to communicate cross-culturally are language, right? That seems like an obvious one. But sometimes we make assumptions just because someone's got a surname that might give you some insight into the language they speak, when in reality, that may not be accurate. The perfect example is my youngest daughter. Her father's last name is Perez. However, he is not of Latino origin and does not speak Spanish. People make lots of assumptions when he enters or she enters the room. We don't speak Spanish. Well, we've taken it in school, but certainly not as our first language. Language can be a tremendous barrier, but certainly the assumptions we make about language can also be a barrier. Environment and technology. This is a big challenge for us, particularly right now in the midst of our pandemic. There are school communities who are operating in many different ways. There are various levels of literacy as it relates to technology. Some teachers had never explored, and if there are any teachers on here, I'm sure you can testify to the fact that you had never used Google Meets as much as you use it today. Today, those of you who are teaching from a remote learning perspective depend upon Google Meets. And so in those days when we've had challenging weather situations, or in fact, when the school just might have lost power, you have lost your whole connection. I chuckled the other day because this part wasn't funny. My daughter's elementary school had a situation where there was smoke. And it was the lockdown situation. And this was at the high school. And I said, oh, so your teacher disconnected your virtual class? She said, no, she brought us in the closet with her. So the teacher is literally under a lockdown drill in the closet with her laptop talking to the students. So they got a big kick out of that. And they felt she's really committed. But hey, they learned something. Resilience under fire, right? For parents who may not have ever had to deal with technology as much as they have to now, it's a challenge when not only you may have challenges with technology, but it's a little bit interesting to be in front of your children and yet not be able to provide them with the skills that they might need. So environment and technology today have definitely shown up in a big way. Culture and history. Who are we individually as people? And what have our cultural norms been? Oftentimes here in the United States, we rely on traditional westernized values. We consider them to be the standard. However, what we don't always take into consideration is that even from geography to geography, region to region, some of those norms vary. And so for those of us here, particularly in the Northeast, and I've spent my entire life in the Northeast, we do exercise some privilege around things that we believe to be true and how we operate in the context of our communities differently than maybe communities in the South or even in the West operate. Also, there are individuals who come to our communities from other cultural realities, cultures who may perceive things differently than we may assume in sort of the dominant culture here in the United States. So there are lots of things for us to learn. And of course, assumptions rear their head yet again. Concepts of authority. Who is the head, right? Is the teacher the expert on the child, or is the parent the expert? Should we consider them both to be credible reporters as it relates to the children? How do we navigate through authority figures? And then there's nonverbal communication, which has become even more challenging in this virtual reality that we live in. You are often able, when you meet with people face to face, you're able to detect certain nonverbal patterns that help you to identify how the person is feeling, whether they're afraid, whether they're disengaged. a little bit harder to do on Zoom or on a phone call. So as we think about these factors impacting our conversations tonight, what would you consider to be some of the implications of the above factors for school communities? How might schools actually be able to play a role in helping to address some of the factors that serve as barriers to cross-cultural communication? Does anyone have any thoughts? Please feel free to type them into the chat. What are the implications of the above factors as it relates to cross-cultural communication or two-way communication within our school communities? How might schools be able to address or support challenges, whether it relates to language or culture, authority, or nonverbal communication, and particularly technology? You don't have to certainly, but be thinking about that. But if you do have some, please feel free to share with each other in the chat. We are a small group tonight, so I will encourage you to unmute and speak. Since there are only, there's a small group of us, so certainly we should be able to connect with one another. See a message in the chat. Okay. So what are the costs and benefits of having difficult conversations? Well, some of the costs are that the proverbial elephant is still in the room. If we choose not to have the difficult conversation, sometimes those issues remain and we might never get beyond them in order to solve whatever the challenge is that's ahead of us. Sometimes when there's a difficult conversation, the lack of engagement or silence can translate to you not caring. So if you don't speak up, sometimes the assumption might be that you're not interested or the issue as it affects someone else doesn't really matter to you. The other thing is that we maintain the status quo when we don't have these difficult conversations. And sometimes that means that resentment can develop. Sometimes the problems get even more complicated because the initial challenges haven't been addressed. In many instances, that can lead to challenged relationships between teachers, administrators, families. The biggest issue around a cost of not having them is the stress. Many of us are cognizant of the need to engage in self-care, and self-care is more than simply getting a manicure or having a massage, but it's being true to sometimes the conversations we need to have to remove those burdens from our minds. And the stress also can have a significant impact on our physical health. On the flip side, what are the benefits of having difficult conversations? There's trust that can be enhanced, and we talked a lot about the importance of trust last month. Empathy can be created. You may not fully understand the challenge that might be addressed, but you can at least empathize. Sometimes the difficult conversations can lead to creativity, an energized climate. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, right? Haven't we heard folks say that? Now we can address the real issues. Now we can move forward. Now we can be creative. We can collaborate with one another. There's greater understanding and ultimately positive change. So while there are a number of costs, there are also a number of benefits that will help to sustain the relationship. Inclusive conversations between families and teachers can be impacted by communication or lack thereof. Potentially blame. Sometimes parents may feel in their conversations with the school community that they aren't necessarily prepared enough to provide their students with the support that they need. So they feel some blame. There can also be mistrust in terms of a lack of inclusive conversations. What if, and we talked about that quite a bit last month, if there's no trust built in the beginning, how can the relationship prosper? And then cultural expectations. Sometimes, again, getting back to assumptions, we may assume that based upon a student's cultural background or a teacher's cultural background, that they may not be equipped to provide what is necessary, that the student may not be capable of excelling and performing in the way that the teacher may expect. And so these are some of the things that also stand in the way, specifically as it relates to conversations between families and teachers. So just a quick model to share with you. And then, as I said, we are going to practice a bit of this opportunity for two-way conversation. I just want to share this model with you. One of the things that's important about thinking ahead about conversations that you might want to have is, first, what is your intent? What is your desired outcome? What do you intend to get out of that particular conversation? How will you behave? What is the behavior that precipitated the conversation? And then what's the impact? So once you have the conversation and both sides have been heard, what is the outcome? Sometimes you know exactly what the consequences are. Maybe you hope that there'll be freer dialogue or that a behavior will be removed. But then there are also the unintended consequences, as many of you spoke to in the chat. Well, what if? What if it's worse? What if I'm misunderstood? What if I say something wrong, right? Those are not ever those things that you intend to happen, but you have to be prepared in the event that they do. So as we think about preparing for the conversation, we thought this topic was particularly timely given the fact that many school communities are engaging in either parent-teacher conferences or student-led conferences at this time of the academic year for the first time, and it'll happen again in the spring. But just some things to think about as you prepare for the conversation, and this goes for parents or families as well as teachers. What are the things that you want to consider? What will be your method of communication? Well, obviously, in most instances, we have been communicating via Zoom or Google Meet or other virtual platforms at this point in time. Who holds the blame, right? We talked about that a little bit. What do you know about the parent or the teacher in advance that will help to shape the conversation? Again, we reference mistrust and cultural expectations as well. This worksheet, which is from Understood, gives you a little bit of an idea of a worksheet that you might be able to utilize to begin in advance to think about those things that, from a parent perspective, you feel like your child is doing well. And then the teacher obviously will have methods of assessment, but this is one of the things that certainly parents and families can use as they too prepare for the parent-teacher conference. So there's preparation on each side. Now, before you engage in the conversation, there are a few things that you need to think about. And from a cultural perspective, or cultural competence or cultural communication perspective, there's some things that you should know. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, we oftentimes make lots of assumptions about people, teachers, families, students. We make our assumptions based upon typically what we know of them, potentially their name, maybe that will give you some insight, what they look like, right? Now you see them. I know before COVID, there were some districts who were moving towards home visits. Well, guess what? Now in our pandemic environment, you can see oftentimes right inside of the home, but maybe you've made some assessments about the street that a student lives on or the town that they live in. Or maybe if you know that information about the teacher, you've made some assumptions about the teacher or the student. Or the parent based upon where they live, how long they've been in the district, etc. So you've got to spend a little bit of time focusing on your own self-awareness of cultural understanding. What is your cultural identity? Who are you? And what does that mean in the context of this conversation? How do you get beyond the notion of blindness, right? We oftentimes hear folks say, I'm colorblind. Or, blindness might apply in other areas. The reality is that we very much do see who people are, without a doubt. And what we might really want to say is that we have chosen in our own reality to not treat people differently, as opposed to saying that you don't see people for who they are, because oftentimes their identity, as yours, is very important to them. And so acknowledge who people are and embrace that as a part of their identity. Facing your own fears and biases. Now, I'll tell you, and I'm not sure if I shared this last month, but I know that I have some biases. We all do. The challenge for us is to identify them and begin to eradicate them. So I know sometimes when I see someone, in particular, my bias is people who have tattoos on their face or neck. So I've now divulged that to all of you. But once I learned that, I began to recognize that I had to talk to myself in order to help me in those situations so that I was able to remove the bias and engage with individuals without adding my judgment or my bias to the scenario. So we've got to do that. We've got to identify what those things are for us and take deliberate steps and action to ensure that we can remove that, particularly from any decision making. And then acknowledging the power and your privilege. This message, to a certain extent, is for our teachers and administrators. When we think about authority and the power that you hold to grade students, you hold a bit of their future in your hands. And parents and families recognize that. And so how do you assert that in the context of your conversations? Do you seek to engage in relationship with the families and the student? Or do you assert your authority such that there could potentially be fear that comes out of that relationship? So just something else to think about. So right before you go into the conversation, check yourself, figure out what's bothering you. Most of the time when I do workshops, I ask folks to send one adjective in the chat that tells me how they're feeling right now. Why do I do that? Because when you become aware of how you're feeling, it helps you to understand how you view the situation you're getting ready to walk into. You might be irritated, frustrated, or disgusted. That has, for a reason that has nothing to do with the conversation or dialogue you're about to enter. You've got to channel and self-direct so that that frustration or anger or irritation directed elsewhere does not show up in the context of your conversation within the context of the school family community. How are you feeling? Sometimes it's okay for us to say, you know what, maybe today's not the best day for our parent-teacher conference. Maybe we should reschedule it for next week, right? When you can be in a better frame of mind with an open mind. What are the things that trigger you? Are you one of those teachers or parents who hates when people are late? What happens if the previous conference was running behind? Now you're frustrated because you're triggered that the individuals are running late. What are the assumptions that you have about the parents you're getting ready to meet? I think I shared with Judy and Betsy early on as we were talking about this, that when my oldest child was in kindergarten, first day of school, August, I wore a navy blue pinstripe business suit to take her to her first day of kindergarten. Why did I do that? Because I wanted the teacher to know that I take my child's education seriously. And I didn't want her to mistake my child for someone whose parent, because of stereotypes that we are aware of, who did not care, was not present. I needed them to know that. But why did I feel like I had to do that? I should not have had to do that, right? I should have been able to go in sweats and sneakers or whatever it was that I chose that day and be received by the school community in the same way, right? So sometimes the assumptions that we have can impact the kind of relationship that we build at the outset. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, what will happen if you don't have the conversation, right? Maybe at the end of the year, you feel like, well, you know what, it doesn't matter. The school year will be over and then I'll have a new set of students. But it may still linger. And so you have to ask yourself, what will happen if you don't? And what would be the outcome? And we are going to do a role play, parent-teacher or family-teacher conference time. The student is attending school in a hybrid format, which means that some days the teachers may engage with them and some days they do not. The parent and the teacher have never met. So perhaps this is the first year in a particular school, or simply that, oops, going too far, or simply that the parent and student had not had an opportunity to engage. Now, there are a number of things, factors that we asked you to consider, that we discussed. We talked about the notion of understanding what your desired outcome is, and also all of the things that you should be aware of as you engage. So what did you do to get started? How did you kick off the dialogue? What are some examples? What did you do?
The teacher introduced herself, but it kind of felt like we had already met and were building relationship. So
Okay.
she seemed very inviting.
Okay.
With us, we brought the child was at the meeting at the conference, and we allowed the child to participate and have their voice.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So the teacher created an inviting environment, made space for everyone, including the student, to enter. I love it. Anyone else have any examples of what you did to get started? Anything different? That was awesome.
So we didn't get to role play my part, but I planned it with, well, I saw a teacher work on it. So the teacher had the kids do slides as reflection about their learning and about themselves. So they talked about their greatest strength, their greatest weakness. They talked about all of their grades. And so when it came to conferences, the student led the conference. And so that was a very strong model, because students were talking to their parents about their own learning, and the teacher got to share in the conversation. So instead of it being a power differential, it was really a student-led one where the family felt empowered because their child was talking about their own learning. And to me, as an administrator, when I walked around and saw the different ones, seeing student voice to me was the strongest, and from my perspective.
Excellent, excellent. Great, great feedback. That was awesome. And I know a lot more districts are doing student-led conferences these days as well. So it really does empower the student, and I think the families as well. Absolutely. So let's move to the second question. How did it feel to listen? So at one point, one of you had to listen to the other, whether you were the family or the student. Were you successful at simply listening?
Yes.
Very good. Let's tell us about it.
Yes, I mean, I really enjoy it because I have interest to listen to I forgot her name, sorry, and so and she was the thing that made me listen to her is the way how she approached the conversation, the meeting, and how she advocate for her child, right? And not just for the child, for the students in general in the classroom. I have the time to listen how she has difficulties or the difficulties that her child was having in the school or in the classroom with certain teachers, not we all. So she was talking a lot what's happening around it, and I have the opportunity, and I even myself, I was like, wow, I took the time to listen, you know what I mean? So
excellent. Listening is indeed a skill. Far too often, many of us are preparing our next statement as opposed to listening when people are talking. So listening is indeed a skill. Now, third question, what did you learn? What did you learn in the context of your scenario? Anybody, or if there was somebody who wanted to talk about how it felt to listen and I cut you off, my apologies.
Apologies accepted.
I played it.
Okay. I want to talk about listening still. Okay. Listening is definitely a highly refined skill. I mean, it can be there's a lot to it. And throughout our little breakout session, I had proposed an issue that I was facing with a couple of students, and asked, for input by the my participants, and I got plenty, and that was great, and it was helpful to me. But sometimes you need to kind of encourage or probe for more responses, or more focused responses, let's say. And if you do that in in a respectful way, I think you get somewhere.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. All really, really good feedback. Absolutely. So what did you learn? Third question. Anybody out there? What did you learn in the context of your scenario? Or what did you learn? Okay, that you can apply in future conversations. Go for it.
Well, I played a disaffected high school student who was goofing off at home because I was bored and I didn't want to talk about it. But the teacher and my mother ganged up on me and started being really sympathetic. And that made me open up.
I love it.
It was people were actually listening to me in a way that acknowledged that I had a right to have opinions and that they cared about what was going on.
That's
And
great.
so
And we do know bored high school students. Yeah, we know bored high school students. So thank you for representing that that part of that segment of our population.
It wasn't hard. I just had to go back about 40 years. My memory.
We appreciate that. What can you apply? What are the things that folks learn and what can you apply to conversations in the future? What are some tools that you thought, wow, okay, I should really think about that the next conversation I have? What'd you learn?
Letting the child be included in the parent-teacher conference. It seems like it gave the child and the teacher kind of a level playing field where they were able to talk about things, and it wasn't like a power over situation where when you're generally in class, like the teacher is the, authoritarian. They were able to talk about where the child wanted to be, what was on the child's mind. So it kind of, the teacher was looking at the child more than a student, like more as a person, I felt.
I love it. More as a person, right? And that's what we are. And that level of respect as it is offered and received is so important in having productive two-way conversations that lead to healthy relationships. Absolutely. This is great, great feedback. Great feedback. Thank you all for participating. So as you know, just a few reminders, some of the things that you experience when you're initiating the contact, you all did it, starting with respect and care, right? Someone talked about how the teacher really created an environment to be engaged, the importance of being empathetic and listening. I'm gonna go back real quick to the remove distractions, right? Because in our reality, there's cell phones, there's other things going on. So we need to be present in that conversation. That's how we learn that the disaffected high school student is disaffected, right? Because we're listening, we're paying attention. Sharing your story, right? That's how you develop, we talked about last time, respect and trust. We got to give each other a little bit about each other so that we can gain a relationship and build respect. Assume positive intent, ultimately on both sides. That everyone is coming to the table in order to get to a positive desired outcome. And then obviously, as you're thinking about the conversation and preparing for it, you got to move to action once you get in the conversation. Agree to a mutual way forward. There may be everything you may be in agreement. There may be times where there's some things you aren't in agreement. Be prepared to find common ground, right? It doesn't mean that because it didn't work this time that it will never work again. You got to keep coming at it. You can agree to disagree, but stay curious. Maybe the person's opinion about your child or the parent's opinion about your teaching may not be in alignment. That does not mean that you cannot have a successful relationship going forward. So stay curious, ask questions continually of one another. And so essentially the tools that are critically important is creating an environment where we can dialogue, where we can ask and answer questions, and not just from a power dynamic perspective, but whether it's teachers, families, students, where they can ask and answer questions and be heard and be a part of the scenario. The roadmap for success, preparation is key, right? We heard, set the tone early, create the environment. Our words matter, what we choose to say and how we say it. Stay focused on the issues. That worksheet that we looked at earlier helped you as a parent or as a teacher. The teachers have many assessments oftentimes. As a parent, what are the things that you want to get out of that parent-teacher conference? Think about what the issues are. And then concluding with resolution, right? We don't have to agree on everything, but we can find common ground. I think this is a really great way to build a relationship that will allow you all, parents, families, teachers, and students, to prosper at the end of the day. So I know before I transition to Betsy, I just wanted you to have this takeaway in your mind. And please feel free to type this into the chat for the edification of everyone else on the call. But think about something tonight that you learned, something that you'll use, and something that you still need to know. Because as you know, we have another session coming up next month, and all of the different values are woven throughout. So we want to be able to address what it is that you still might need to know. But we think it will be great to hear from you. What are things that you learned, and what's something that you'll use from tonight? And so with that, I will turn it over to Betsy. Please feel free to type into the chat as we're talking. I know we're short on time, so I want to make sure that if there are things you learned, we want to hear from you, things that you'll use, those tools that you learned, we want to hear from you. But with that, I thank you all for your active engagement, incredible solutions and suggestions. And Betsy, I will turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Joelle. What great information. Thank you. And great, very specific opportunities for people to talk together. It was great. So I thank everyone for being here tonight. As you know, I think you can see on the bottom, we have another after hours, which is, so just make sure that you know of the new time, which is 6:30 to 7:30. I know that maybe there was some kind of a little bit of a miscommunication about that, but we want to make sure that you know that. And then Friday Cafe. And I want to thank you all, your comments, your conversation, this whole idea about really, I love the idea about how we can again, kind of begin to kind of do these conversations that don't have to be adversarial, but they can be concrete and they can be in partnership. So Joelle, thank you. Thank you, every single person who is here. We appreciate your involvement.